It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Community Architecture and Human Rights webinar today. My name is Nadia Tromp. I'm the co-director of the Community Architecture and Human Rights Work Programme for the UIA, hosting this webinar together with my co-director, Kazi Arif, and our work program member, Nicholas Patsovas, as moderator today. Firstly, we would like to thank the UIA President Cortez and the UIA Secretary General Pei Ying for the continued support of the Community Architecture and Human Rights Work Programme and for giving us their time to participate today. We welcome you. Welcome to all the member sections represented here today. This is part 2 of a series of webinars focusing on sustainable housing for resilient communities. In our August webinar, we focused on the challenges of affordability in housing. Today, we will focus on sustainable housing for resilient communities and the impact on our environment. There is no doubt that the role of governments and policy play in decreasing the environmental impact on our urban environments and how crucial this is. As we work together towards the UIA Congress in Copenhagen in July, with the theme of sustainable futures, leave no one behind, we shift our focus to the global south to discover sustainable solutions to enable a leap forward in thinking towards accomplishing the goals by 2030. As the Community Architecture and Human Rights Work Programme, our goal is to promote, discuss, create and showcase architecture as a vital tool to achieve the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We will share sustainable solutions, examine the latest research results, and join our efforts to make the 28th UIA World Congress a milestone in the history of what architecture can do to help save the planet. Our work program aims to encourage architects to be mindful of the Sustainable Development Goals in all the projects which they undertake, and that we become positive contributors to a better world. Unfortunately, our colleague Lucila Aguilar from Mexico is unable to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances, so we may finish a few minutes earlier than scheduled. But we are very privileged to still have the 2 other guests, architect Mokena Makeka and architect Jackie Kyla, join us today. Just a note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the UIA YouTube channel and sent to all participants who registered. I now hand over to our UIA President, Jose Cortez, to share a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Well, I am Jose Luis Cortez from Mexico. Warm greetings from Mexico. At the moment, I am the president of the International Union of Architects. And on the name of the International Union of Architects, I want to congratulate Nadia Tromp and Casey Afif, the co-directors of this wonderful group, Community Architecture and Human Rights. And they have been doing a wonderful job, on these different issues related with sustainable housing for resilient communities and the impact on environment. I believe that the topic is very important for UIA, and I encourage all of you to be prepared to attend the World Congress in Copenhagen this first week of July 2023. So I'm very glad that we have 2 guests that are very well known in their own countries. From South Africa, Mr. Mokeka, and from Zambia, Colin Kay. And I hope that you will enjoy this webinar. I am sure that from this webinar, many good ideas will come that we can share with many other countries during our Congress in Copenhagen. So thank you very much, Nadia, for the introduction, and good luck to everybody. And I am very happy that you are an important part of UIA. Thank you.
Thank you, President. I'd now like to hand over to our UIA Secretary General, Architect Pei Ying.
Hello, everybody. My warmest greeting. from the International Union of Architects. I'm Pei Ing, the UIA Secretary General, and it is my pleasure to be here with all of you today. So on behalf of the UIA, we would like to express our sincere gratitude towards the organizing committee members of the UIA Community Architecture and Human Rights Work Programme, under the capable leadership of the two co-directors, Nadia Trom and Katsi Arif, for organizing this important webinar, our esteemed presenters and the moderator for your immense contribution towards this very critical topic, and the UIA Secretariat, Sonia, Muyati, and Claudia, for all the hard work that has gone into coordinating and promoting this webinar. The UIA work programs are very important parts of the UIA. They are policy-driven and relevant to the critical aims of the UIA, with the representations from all the 5 regions. The UIA Community Architecture Program is dedicated to advancing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with a particular emphasis on Goal 11, making cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Today's presentation will be focusing on sustainable housing for resilient communities, the impact on our environment, which is a continuation of the discussions of our UIA Madrid International Forum with the theme Affordable Housing Activation that will lead to the UIA next key milestone, that is the UIA Copenhagen World Congress on Sustainable Futures, Leave No One Behind. Sustainable housing is a crucial component of a sustainable future for our planet, and today's topic is particularly relevant in light of the global challenges we face today, which include climate change, rapid urbanization, and population growth that have a significant impact on our built environment. We are heading towards a more urbanized environment with more than 50% of today's population living in urban areas. This number will rise to more than 70% in 2050. By 2030, about 40% of the world's population will need access to adequate housing, and about 100 million people worldwide are homeless. This translates into a demand for around 100,000 new affordable and accessible housing units per day. In addition to that, the rapid and ill-controlled urbanization have created a lot of problems in addition to serious climate change, and at least 25% of the people live in harmful conditions that are detrimental to their health, safety, and prosperity. Access to safe, stable, and affordable housing was first recognized as a human right in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this has since been reaffirmed in many international treaties, resolutions, and declarations. UN Habitat places affordability, sustainability, and inclusiveness of the housing sector at the core of the urbanization process to ensure provisions of adequate housing for all, which is a precondition for access to employment, education, health, and social services to promote better and healthier lives. There's increasing evidence showing that properly planned housing and urban environments will deliver multiple benefits to the health and well-being of the community. It is therefore essential that urban environment must develop in harmony with the UN guiding principles, and the government and all the other stakeholders should put housing at the center of urban policies by placing people and human rights at the forefront of urban sustainable development in order to address the current housing challenges. And as architects, we have a unique responsibility to design and build homes that not only meet the needs of our community, but also contribute positively to our environment. The COVID-19 also highlighted the great need for us to transform our design parameters and philosophy to deliver a more sustainable housing for a more resilient community. It also highlighted the importance of collaborative, responsive, and creative way for the architects and the other stakeholders, including the public, to work collectively to bridge technology, research, and design, and to catalyze actions to influence the urban and housing transformation. Through this webinar, we hope to bring together experts to share knowledge and experiences and to learn from each other. We will explore the impact of sustainable housing on our environment and on the resilience of our communities, and we will discuss strategies and developing solutions that will help us to achieve a more sustainable future for all. Last but not least, we thank all of you for joining this webinar, and we look forward to your active engagement in a fruitful discussion, which will result in positive outcomes that will be integrated into the UIA Copenhagen World Congress discussion. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Pei. Thank you for that. And thank you for reaffirming how important this work program and this work is to the UIA, which is crucial. I'd now hand over to our moderator, Nicholas, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mrs. Secretary General. So far already, I think the main objective of today's meeting has been very openly and very clearly described by the previous speakers. I'll try to be as brief as possible so that we allow more time available to our honorable speakers that follow. Now, in our group, we have decided to invite prominent speakers and colleagues, architects from all possible regions of the UIA to share the regional and local experience in defining the current challenges and sharing innovative out-of-the-box ideas and projects. In that sense, we have planned this series of the two webinars. This is the second one, as already mentioned, in order to host a lively and much-needed dialogue, mapping the field and balancing the need for tactical immediate action with the planning of future strategies being included in that objective. This forum is designed in order to channel proved professional knowledge to young architects and students of architecture also, which we hope are attending and will follow also this webinar when it is uploaded. Beyond presenting an array of successful case studies, our dear colleagues are invited to draw attention and to stimulate an inclusive and future-proof continuous channel of communication on local action regarding global priorities and risks. Now, our UIA work program on community architecture and human rights, as already explained, focuses on the 11th Sustainable Development Goal on sustainable cities. In that sense, the objectives the relative objectives include providing safe and affordable housing, fostering inclusive and sustainable urbanization, protecting the world's cultural and natural heritage, as well as ensuring access to safe, inclusive, green and public spaces in our global metropolis and the overall connected network of cities around the globe. During the most recent period punctuated by continuous crises of different sorts, from sanitary, environmental to fiscal, energy and social crises, communities around the globe have been required to enhance their resilience in order to meet their daily needs. It is important, though, that long-term sustainability goals not to be compromised by short-term urgency, as our communities struggle for survival. Short-term and long-term objectives will require a new set of principles, methods, and tools which are complementary and not exclusive to one another. Considering the above, our group has focused on the issue of housing policies and projects' environmental impact as a key to addressing this holistic agenda, and has invited our two colleagues, Jacqueline Sheila, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it well, and Mokena Makeka from South Africa, in order to present through their own experience and the process they have been involved, how they have confronted similar challenges, and that is share with us the innovative content of their experience and the context they have been involved with. Now, through this, we initiate a kind of dialogue, or we continue a kind of dialogue, which continues in a way what had been already since the 70s, started being developed globally through the initiatives of Konstantinos Doxiadis and the first UN Habitat initiatives for a new scientific and creative common ground between ecologistics, the holistic study of human settlements, and ecology. In that sense, the study of human settlements, the development of human settlements, and their relationship to both the study, the scientific study of ecology and its practices. The intention is to stimulate an inclusive and forward-thinking discussion on harmonizing local action with global priorities and risks. And having said that, I think we can move on to the next chapter of our meeting today, and with the first presentation by architect Jackie Silla, who is the co-founder and co-director of One-to-One Agency of Engagement, a design-based social initiative addressing structural spatial inequality in South African cities. She has over 10 years of experience working across Southern and Central Africa with a focus on urban upgrading, community engagement, and participatory development processes through socio-technical work. Since 2019, she has been working for SUM Consult as a short-term consultant for a violence prevention project in Kinshasa, being responsible for the design, monitoring, and technical evaluation of the implementation of crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED, the acronym. And it's a new approach that she will be sharing with us. So I think I can,
Nicolas.
Please to her.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's quite overwhelming when you say it in such a complimentary fashion. I think I just wanted to begin this presentation with this image. I think it speaks incredibly loudly from the context of South Africa. At the moment, the work I'm going to share with you today is predominantly in the Gauteng region of South Africa, which is where Johannesburg, the city of Pretoria, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni is, where most of our population is living in informal settlements. The climate crisis is upon us, and the poor are bearing the brunt of it. And you can see it in the way that people are living. We are suffering with service delivery challenges, lack of electricity, lack of water. This week, we have a national water crisis. And this is what our environment is currently looking like for large amounts of the population. So I work for an organization called One-to-One. I'm the co-founder with my partner, John Bennett, and a previous founder who has since passed. We don't practice traditional architecture. And I think the perspective that we bring is of a very different type of looking at architecture. You're welcome to have a look at the website. I'm not going to go into too much depth and waste time on what exactly it is that we do. I mean, people can look in their own time. But essentially, we are a non-profit organization that tries to support positively and systemically shape the way that South African cities are seen, made, and managed for a spatially just future. And that means we're looking at spatial justice. And specifically in South Africa, that is quite complex. We're dealing with an apartheid legacy. Our cities are segregated. And there is a huge amount of intersectional challenge that hits us in every realm of our urban environment. And working with specifically marginalized groups of people in informal areas is where our focus has been. So we started One-to-One 12 years ago. And we have, in this 12 years, unpacked a very large amount of complexity in the informal sector. Informal spaces are, by definition, what's left over and are occupied by people who are also left over and forgotten. And in our introduction, we spoke about leave nobody behind. Huge amounts of our population already being left behind. And that's who we're working with. I mean, you can see just by this one image how complex informality is in our context of Johannesburg and of our environment. We've got occupied buildings, we have empty buildings, we have shackland, informal settlements with the characterization of your corrugated iron structures. We've got falling down structures, a very complicated view of informality, specifically in the city. And this is the context that we work in. For this particular context, we always look at things from a human rights approach, just because that is the way that we've started our practice. But we also recognize that there are a lot of other factors that feature into the approach. So when we look at things from a human rights approach, and we only look at how things should be in terms of human rights and in terms of our beautiful constitution. South Africa has one of the most magnificent constitutions in the world upholding human rights. We can say that things are right or wrong, or they should be in a different way because of the human rights. But that doesn't take into account the complexities of political will, of economic struggle, of livelihoods engagements, of affordability, as you've spoken about in your previous discussion and webinar. These things all factor into the way that we look at things. So from one-to-one's perspective, we've tried to be as pragmatic as possible. And what I want to share with you is just, I don't want to say that we have a solution, because we definitely do not, but we have some tools and some methods and some ways of looking at things that might help a greater struggle. Looking at this topic was quite a difficult one for me. Unpacking it in terms of what exactly we're looking at was quite complicated. We are looking at things from an emergency response. Like I stated in our first image, we're already in it. The climate crisis is upon us. We are in an emergency response, and that is where we're working. So we look at things from a human rights perspective, and we look at things for our well-being. What does that mean for our well-being as everyone on this one tiny planet? And I unpack this topic and ask the question of what is sustainable? What do we mean by sustainable? Do we mean this is sustainable for our environment? Do we mean this is sustainable for the residents of our certain areas? Do we mean this in terms of how long things can last? And what kind of provision do we have for the long term? As architects, a lot of the time we come in with a solution. It's a design, we make a building, we have a one-time impact, we have one chance. But a lot of the time in our experience, the complexity on sustainability is the flow of money for maintenance and the flow of money for upholding the things that already exist. And it's a different way of looking at things from an economic perspective, but also how do we look at things as architects? Do we put plans in place for how things will be looked after we leave, after we finish this building, after we've walked away, we've signed our last check, and we've handed it over, there's an occupation certificate. What have we left behind that allows our construction and our contribution to be sustainable? How long are things sustainable for is another question. The other question is housing, and I think McKenna is probably going to go into more depth than me, so I'm going to leave this one to him. But we don't look at things as housing. One of our documents that we published during COVID is called The Boundary of Home. And it talks about like, where does home start and where does home end? And that comes into this question of human settlements. Human settlements are so much more than housing, especially in the informal sector. When you have shared communal facilities, shared communal sanitation, water, access to cooking facilities, access to roads as passage, as a space in between your living units, housing is not as simple as housing. This is a hostel, Denver in the south of Johannesburg. It's a informal settlement that's grown on a hostel. So it's not just housing, it's single men units surrounded by women and children and families in a very kind of broken system, because housing isn't what we wish that it would be. Then the other question is for. Who are we designing these things for? Our grassroots partners, Uskoteni Network and ICRC and ICF, they have a statement that nothing is for us without us. And that's probably one of the guiding factors that we have at One-to-One, is that there can be nothing done for anyone. Everything must be done with whoever it is that's going to occupy that space. Our end user or our resident occupant is the client, and they are the driving force of everything that we do. Resilient is another question. Resilient in the face of what? And I think that ties very tightly into this question of sustainability. How resilient are we and for how long? We can put things in place that are wonderful for 5 years or for 10 years or for 6 years or for 6 months. And that resilience and the time period once again ties into that question of what happens when we leave. My business partner, Jono, always speaks about communities as a thing that doesn't exist. And I have to agree, communities is a very difficult topic, because what is a community? Is a community a group of residents that live in one space? What do they have in common? Do they have a common collective? Is there a committee? Is there a structure that's formed to represent that community? A lot of the time we use community as a way of describing a group of people who may or may not have anything in common at all, or may have very, very complex conflicts within a group of people. And that also affects the way that we engage and the way that we do the work that we do. Impact is another question. Obviously, as architects, we do one impactful intervention, or 2 or 3 or 5. We feel our impact on the ground as soon as we've put something down. But then what happens? What happens when the municipality doesn't collect the waste? What happens when your soccer field is inundated? And there's nothing that we can do as designers of that space once we've kind of left that behind into the role of government, into the role of municipality. And then our environment, it's ours, it's all of ours, it's global. In the global south, we might feel far away and cut off from the rest of the world, but this is a global problem. And then environment, the question of environment and who is living in what kind of environment. This is a temporary relocation area, also in Johannesburg, after an occupied parking garage was destroyed. And I want the participants to just for a second imagine what it would be like to live in one of these temporary relocation areas. They're supposed to be temporary. People are living in this particular space. I mean, it's already been a year, 8 months, 10 months of staying in one of these rooms. This is the environment. This is what housing looks like. I mean, when we talk about policy, sometimes they talk about access to housing as your human right. And it's access to the housing ladder. At what level of this housing ladder do we have access? This is considered access. Yeah. This is what Johannesburg is looking like at the moment, and City of Tshwane is the flooding section. Just a reminder of this is where we are now. These are the environments that we're working in. First image is Bertram's in Eastern Johannesburg, Cemetery View in the City of Tshwane under the current floods that are happening, and then Zampilililo in Region 3, where we had a fire this weekend. When I say we're in an emergency response, we had 3 fires this weekend, just before this discussion that we're having. So in 3 of our settlements, we've had fires with fatalities. With our partners, it gets heavy at times. And that brings us to the question of the current conditions that we're dealing with. How bad is it? And how do we work out how bad it is? And that means we have to have contact with the ground and contact in the informal spaces, in the informal settlements, and also in the buildings. And then we ask ourselves the question, as architects, what is our role in the space? So we find these things, this is what we're finding on the ground. And then what? How do we have impact? What exactly is it that we can do to make impact in these spaces? So from one-to-one's perspective, we look at a kind of coexistence. So we like to co-diagnose the problems. When I say how bad is it, this is not something that I'm coming up with a solution on my own or as architects in an office. This is something that has to happen in partnership with the residents in the areas where we're working. The same as the co-design solution and the co-developed, hopefully a solution. It's incredibly important that we work as a partnership and in a participative approach with predominantly a community-led program. But a lot of the time, like I said, community is quite complicated and quite complex. So we can have something that we champion as community-led, but how much of your community is engaged? So our approach has been in this co-design and co-develop process is to build the capacity of the residents in the areas that we're working. And this means including our community facilitators in academic programs, including our community facilitators in engagement programs, and building as much capacity and sharing as much knowledge as we possibly can. to take our approaches to scale, there is no ways that a small group of architects can make huge impact. But if every group of leadership and every group of capacitated residents in every informal settlement in the country can start impactfully changing their own environment, then we have some sort of a chance. I mean, obviously that's a dream, it's an absolute dream, but it's working a little bit with a few very capacitated, fantastic community leaders. We've started by delivering, well, not started, but we are delivering and developing tools that then assist and capacitate our community facilitators and our capacitated leadership. And these tools, predominantly through COVID, we shifted to make them very digital. And in the last year, where we can actually go outside again, we've realized sometimes the paper and the models and the pins are far more effective and have a lot more impact. And these tools are here to bring us together as professionals, as engineers, as architects, as developers, as plumbing specialists, as great service delivery professionals, and as municipalities and government, to bring the language together so that our communities speak the same technical language or some technical language that the professionals speak, and the professionals hopefully can also understand where the communities are coming from. We've been developing some roadmaps for upgrading, and we've had some impact. Some taps delivered in settlements. Sometimes that's the win. Sometimes it's one water point. Sometimes it's a fence, and sometimes it's a building design. These are the types of impacts that keep us going. And then I think the most important thing to note is that none of us can do this alone. And we have a huge amount of partnerships and a great support base. And if you look at this support, this is only some of the partners, and I'm actually embarrassed that I haven't put everyone on, but there's not enough space on a slide. But we need a multidisciplinary team to look at these crises. The multidisciplinary team is incredibly important to see all aspects of the problem. And then we have the privilege of focusing on things from an architectural approach with the skills that we have, without stepping on the toes of policymakers, of government officials, of human rights lawyers. It just means that we have to have them with us. Thank you very much. I hope I've asked some questions and answered not so many.
Yeah, thank you very much for this analytical, in a way, address to our call. Like you managed to pick up each one of the words you use and provide with a real meaning to our concept. So really thank you. And we now move on to the second presentation by architect Mokena Makeka, who is a founder of Design Works, an international award-winning architectural and urban planning firm, and senior advisor at Dalberg. He's an expert on urban development and affordable housing, and has extensive experience of chairing, founding, and serving on boards. And those roles include his participation in the South African Heritage Resources Agency, the Cultural and Creative Industries Federation of South Africa, and Cape Town Heritage Trust. He's a young global leader at the World Economic Forum of 2015, member of the WCS Young Leaders in Urbanism, and has served as an advisor to the South African Ministry of Human Settlements. Thank you very much, Mokena, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you all, colleagues. I'm just making sure that the presentation is up. Give me one moment. Thank you. Thank you. So super exciting platform and interesting discussion from a number of perspectives. This presentation will be structured really in 3 parts. The front section kind of sets a bit of an argument in terms of how I see some of these issues. The second part will be one particular design project in Cape Town, South Africa. And then the third part will be an example of work that we're doing in Rwanda, looking at some of the challenges in terms of housing provision. So just to kind of kick off, I think it's important to locate the conversation from the perspective of rights. And I basically penned these sort of 10 points really to aggregate not only my thinking, but thinking of others on this issue, and somewhat speaks to the Vitruvian idea, the sort of 10 principles of architecture. Without going through them in any detail, I'll just give you a quick highlight. The first is the principle of human rights. The second one is, how do we build an approach where the planet is a stakeholder, and how we think about urbanization, that we need to reflect time and place and space, that architecture can be a vehicle for dialogue, and how we think about habitat, that architecture and urbanism is about being a guardian of ecologies and place, recording the values of the present for future generations. So how we preserve and what we create is a bit of a statement of our values as a society, but also the importance of delight in the senses and how to be inclusive and impact, countering inequality, embracing technology, but also to see architecture as a creative endeavor with this larger global purpose. Now, how does that relate to this question of the environment? The reality is that at current consumption rates, we will probably need about 2.3 planets in order to survive by the year 2050, and clearly we don't have 2.3 planets. So if we think of the emissions, which are partly due to the construction sector, roughly 40%, 38% depending on where you stand, 35% in terms of final energy consumption, in terms of how buildings are occupied and so on. And then you couple that also with the annual increase in global floor area, we're faced with a very, very particular challenge about how do we think about urbanization in general. Africa and the global south is particularly vulnerable to climate change. We know the effects of climate migration. We know the effects of extreme weather patterns. We understand that even in terms of economic resilience, Africa is not best positioned to deal with the challenges of climate change. But if you couple that with population growth between now and 2035 and 2050, where even parts of the continent, such as the Congo Basin, are expected to double in population, it presents a real serious challenge about how do we engage with the environment, and what is the role of housing and infrastructure, and how does it work together. But I think it's important to reiterate that architecture and design can impact on climate change, that we're not passive agents in terms of this broader question of how do we protect environments, but the way that we think about net zero embodied carbon, both at the top end of buildings, but even how we think about housing in an inclusive fashion, has a huge impact in terms of how we can reimagine our cities. And when we don't do this, it produces high degrees of urban inequality, but this also drives what we'd call carbon intense lifestyles. So intense inefficiencies and so on, both in terms of access to resources, livelihoods, and so on, and increased environmental instability. So we do have to decouple our carbon intense lifestyles from how we currently imagine placemaking and urban design. You know, my previous colleague spoke about the importance of housing versus human settlements, and I hold this as true. The term housing remains very popular both within our profession and broadly, but I do want to draw a distinction that we've seen many projects where in the provision of housing, human settlement and place gets lost. So when we think about public space, when we think about integration with commercial opportunity, when we think about local communities, when we think about public accessibility and even public transport, very often we find that in a housing narrative, these fall off the table. They're not included in the financial narrative, and housing is provided, but it produces very negative environments, as shown by my colleagues. So I still repeat the importance of, in some ways, being cautious about using housing as a frame for what is effectively really the question of a sustainable human settlement. So when we think about designing green cities, and this is in my own image, but I think it does tell a very good story, it really begins to speak about how do we find a coupling between environmental resources, social resources, and economic resources, looking particularly at the role of transport, understanding water, public green space, how we structure our blocks, how we deal with urban heating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these guidelines are, I think, fundamental to our imagining of how we need to think about environment. I also make a distinction because, of late, it's quite popular to also talk about human-centric design and so on, as if somehow the human being is the ultimate objective in terms of how we think about urban development. I actually think that there's a higher level of consciousness that's required, and I call it a planet-centric approach. In the beginning, when we think about design and architecture, it's what I'd call technocentric. So it's the technology, it's how we assemble buildings and so on. We've now evolved to understanding human centricity, but I think we now need to get to the point of planet centricity, which is about humans in relation to environment and in relation to ecology. And the way to think about this is that we require, arguably, and this is a phrase that's not only mine, I share it with others, this question of 6 senses. So a sense of what is justice, a sense of ecological limits, a sense of place, a sense of history, a sense of design, and a sense of nature. And having a 6th sense approach to how we think about a planet-centric way of thinking about design, I think is where we need to evolve. Now, what does this mean? When we think about human settlements, there's a strong relationship between design and capital flows and understanding economic opportunity. So we've just listed in some of our previous works some ideas about how we can begin thinking about sustainable human settlements, more than the design, but understanding how do we tie it back in terms of protecting rainforests or other ecological landscapes. How do we think about housing as a form of an urban accelerator that supports job creation? How do we see that it can catalyze funding from other actors in terms of how we think about greening our cities and reforestation of the continent in general? And launching collaboratives, using data, and then thinking quite intelligently about how we can couple energy and smart housing across the continent to make more sustainable sort of environments. And of course, the question of how do we look at different construction materials? There are a whole range. I have a particular preference, but I think even the material choices that we use can not only create jobs, but also have a dramatically different impact in terms of housing provision. So the notion of using corrugated iron sheeting because it's the cheapest material is both ecologically unintelligent. It's not good from a user perspective, nor does it actually offer the potential for as much local job creation as other sorts of materials. Now, moving to where this sort of theory hits the ground, if you will, I thought I'd share with you one project. It's based in Cape Town in an area called Scottsville. I'd say a sort of lower middle income sort of area with high degrees of unemployment, but some degree of formal infrastructure. Those of you who do know Cape Town and South Africa, is that we often perhaps unfortunately compete with Brazil in terms of having the highest levels of inequality from a Gini coefficient perspective. So we toggle between South Africa and Brazil between 2016 and now. And this is something that we're not proud of. But in the city that I'm in, which is both beautiful and attractive in so many ways, it also has high degrees of inequality and informal environments and a housing backlog that is quite serious. So it's also important to point out the contrasts of these sorts of cities. Now, the site that I had the opportunity to work on, which is really the sort of quadrant on the top left-hand corner, and you see these sort of diagonal lines. What I did was to really try and understand place and understand existing patterns of movement, and to use that to inform how the site could actually work. On the bottom right-hand side, you'll also see there's a railway station. So for me, it was about connecting this housing opportunity to public transport, but also in the way that we re-articulate space, that we acknowledge the past and we acknowledge history and we acknowledge place. A typical response that as one would imagine from most urbanists, would be to create a perimeter block with either a series of internal courtyards to create street. And in many ways, this is urban design 101. I think it's useful and important as a departure point for design. But as you can see there, these sort of orange circles represent the intersection between these different movement lines, and they represent energy to some extent. I decided to deform the urban block to acknowledge these sorts of urban linkages so that the housing begins to not create a sort of internal cloistered courtyard that is divorced from the public space and the city, but rather to bring the city and public space into the heart of the design, and also to acknowledge existing movement patterns. And this allowed me to create a very different sort of urban response, still creating street, but also allowing the public realm to come right into the heart of the project. And then understanding what does that mean in terms of having smaller size courtyards, but also aggregating the architecture together so that you get economies of scale from a housing point of view. So not one house, one plot, but really a sort of redefinition of what an apartment block would look like, but still giving intimacy in certain parts of the project. In terms of the plan view, what we also did was to occupy an adjacent piece of land, which was used as a a sort of derelict soccer pitch. I conceptualized it as a sort of urban food park where residents would be able to grow their own vegetables. There was this idea about how can one create commerce and how can we also not only re-green the city from a landscape and impression perspective, but also from a food sovereignty point of view. I think all too often when we think about landscape design, we often see it as the beautification of the city as opposed to its productive potential. So we do need to think much more intensely about food production within cities, because that also creates jobs, but also creates better opportunities for nutrition. But I actually think it's a more ecological, sustainable perspective for how we should be thinking about greening our cities. In terms of the actual architectural layout, there are 7 different typologies, which is also unique. So it moved all the way from sort of hostel shared bathroom arrangements up to about 2 to 3 bedroom sort of units. And that was quite intentional to try and capture as many different sectors of society within the same site. And my construct was that to think of the neighborhood as the city and the city as the neighborhood, and not see housing as dealing with only one financial segment of society, because I believe that produces the ghettoization of culture too. And this was then coupled, as I mentioned, with weaving it with internal sort of public spaces with varying degrees of privacy, understanding how do you bring buildings close together so that you can create shadows, which are vital during the hot summer months. So the urban form, the movement system, the food production strategy, and the housing distribution all came together. I'm very passionate about the importance of scale, how we make street 3-story walk-ups, but as you get closer into the deeper parts of the site, 4 to 5, 6 stories, actually pulling away from the actual street itself. And these are just very quick schematic iterations of how those units began to work, also ideally offering some degree of greenery within the piece. Now, what's fascinating about this is that people say, well, does this look like housing? It looks like an institutional building, etc. But I think it was a deliberate attempt to deconstruct this image of what does a human settlement have to look like from this suburban ideal, which still seems to be very predominant in terms of our financial modeling, and actually excludes a whole lot of other actors. Construction strategy was assembled using really thinking about lightweight materials, a combination between steel and wood, and then obviously brick and concrete frames in a certain section, but very much this idea of rapid assembly, the ability for the building to be refurbished by people on site, and that in fact the maintenance of the building also becomes a sort of job opportunity and job creation device. I was quite intentional about changing the visual aesthetic of the site, or rather of the human settlement, and beginning to make provocations about how the public spaces could be used differently for internal food production, as mentioned. And here's a bit of just a quick section where you can see the sort of pink section works as a sort of opportunity for commerce on the ground floor, with access towards the back, bringing light in via a central corridor, and having a sort of what we all know, a sort of live work commercial opportunity arrangement. And we often forget this because it's quite commonplace that when people imagine housing, they don't actually think as much about what are the economic opportunities and how can a unit be converted into a place of commerce and job creation. And I think it's vital, particularly in the global south with depressed economies, to think of housing not as an object in itself, but really as a vehicle towards livelihoods. And this is just an internal render looking at some of those spaces and how they could begin to be articulated. Moving quickly onto Rwanda, so less imagery here. This exercise was really about understanding the challenges of another African country, very similar challenges to South Africa. Obviously, the financial metrics are slightly different, but the broad principles about housing provision is actually somewhat similar, and that's why I thought I'd share it. Kigali has a master plan about enhancing green growth, but also as a housing backlog and a vision with regards to 2050. And I, in fact, encourage all cities to have a vision about where they'd like to be between 2030 and 2050 from an SDG perspective and beyond. One of the things that we found in a couple of challenges, limited liquidity of households, high degrees of rental, median incomes that make it difficult to afford housing in the way that we understand, a high cost of borrowing, limited availability of data to inform the offering. So both the bankers are using either outdated algorithms or or don't have enough data to understand what can actually people afford. This produces a whole series of challenges in terms of their own version of the gap market, structural lack of affordability, even though potentially those people can afford that. And in Kenya, where we've also done some work, communities actually aggregate capital. And you find that if you look at housing provision from a community perspective, the affordability works. But if you look at it from an individual household perspective, it doesn't work. So even the way we think about funding housing, I think, needs to be much more agile to recognize the realities of the global South. Just some statistics here, looking at how the banks, the type of loans that they support, their term rates, etc. And this really goes to the heart of this gray area between the formal versus the informal. And how do we make that bridge between the two much more pertinent? There's lack of sufficient mortgage liquidity facilities in Rwanda, expensive amortization schedules and high cost of borrowing, as I've mentioned. And there's also a need for better targeting to low to middle income earners. And this narrative, I promise you, is the same across the global South. The figures might change, but the systemic issues remain somewhat common in my experience. So there's a question about affordable construction materials, flexible payments and financing for users, and also a customer-oriented design. And we've looked at a number of different projects, different developers, how they looked at these sort of challenges. And this common thread about bringing people back to a planet-centric approach becomes important, understanding the importance of place, but also financial viability. And we need far much more financial imagination around how we can support and ensure that everybody has access to housing opportunities in livable, sustainable human settlements. So in closing, really just to say that I think it's important for us as architects to be conversant both at the level of design strategies and what we can do in terms of making place work, but also we need to be far much more agile in terms of the language of development, understanding incentives, how do we mitigate risks for developers and buyers, and how do we take advantage of legislation where it does exist, or be instrumental in terms of changing policy formulations for access to housing. And I think ultimately, if we do that, we can find a solution in which we can not only have a better environment, but we can actually service and provide more opportunities for people who are in dire need of housing access. The current models that we have right now are reproducing informality, entrenching inequality, and are detrimental towards the environment. And with that, I can end my presentation, and I thank you for that. Over.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I think we are in a very good situation in terms of our time schedule, so we can definitely have 20 minutes we have planned for questions and answers from our audience. To start with, we already have 2 questions which you can address to us through the Q&A button or the chat button, and we can transfer these questions to our speakers. The first question by Professor Fanny Tsinika is addressed to Jackie Siller. I'm reading loudly for those who cannot read the question. You mentioned poor people and the complexity of sustainability as a term and as a practice. How poor people can react and participate in having better living conditions, and I mean that at the planning and design process. Are they a very big part of global population, helpless, relying only on us architects, engineers, and the policymakers? Are there any recent examples that prove architects can act really politically? What is our role? The same way you asked also through your presentation.
This is a very complex question, but also maybe a simple one. I think the first part of your question was how poor people can react and participate. I think the first step in that is inclusive discussion and making sure that our planning procedures and our engagements are truly participative and not manipulative and consultative in the way that we approach things. A lot of the time when we have development projects, there's a tick box exercise of whether the community was consulted and maybe somebody gets spoken to, or there's one public meeting or a workshop or an engagement, and it's a thing that gets done. as one phase of the process. But in real life, it's not like that. We need true inclusion in the process from the beginning until the end, where residents and end users are included in every phase of the discussion, from the design inception all the way until the deliverable of the final product. And that, I think, we have in policy in South Africa. It's beautifully included in the upgrading of informal settlements policy. They move the I's and the U's around sometimes. It's included in the policy, but the implementation is not there yet. So yeah, I think from that perspective, it's a policy question as well as an implementation of policy. And as architects, our role in that is holding that policy and that implementation to account. We are on that project as a project manager or as an agent. We have that responsibility to hold those things as an account to account. And then your other question was, are people helplessly relying upon us? Sometimes, but also sometimes not. As informal settlements, especially post-COVID for us or during COVID for us, large amounts of informal settlements grew in that time. And the shaping of our cities is done informally by people who put up settlements and take buildings. And I mean, government officials will call it land invasion. But it is settlement design, and it is human settlement design. It might not be from a planning perspective, but that is who we're working with. We're working with people who have already designed their settlements. And if we respect them as professionals in that way, because they have actually already built the human settlement, we have people that we can engage with on an equal footing. But there needs to be capacity built in terms of understanding how to read a drawing, how to build a model, how to express yourself in a drawing that an engineer can understand. And I mean, that's a large component of our work, is trying to build that capacity. Even just reading a map of where a flood line is. So if you are going to put up an informal settlement, or as leadership is going to expand their settlement, that they can read that drawing where the flood line is and not put households there. And then examples of architects that can act politically. Every act of an architect is political. Everything that we do is political, especially in the global south. The way that we spend clients' money, the way that we put things up, absolutely everything that we do is political. We shape the cities. So I think, yeah, I don't know if there's a way of sharing like active political engagement, but yeah, from our perspective, everything that we do is political. As much as we might want to avoid it, it is.
Thank you very much. I think you were very clear and you covered the whole of the question, the two questions combined. We can move on to the next question, which is probably addressed to both our guests. And it's about the comparison between vertical development and horizontal development of housing and development initiatives, especially regarding, of course, their sustainability. So if there is some kind of proposition from our speakers regarding this question.
I'll take that one.
Or
yeah.
ground.
I'll take that one. So I think there's a fine balance, but I can say this: if you look at the economics of place and construction, you require minimal densities in order for the building cost to come down. But in order for what I call serendipity to happen, if you have very low density environments, serendipity doesn't become possible. And what is serendipity? Serendipity is, in a given area, if there are 30 or 40 people, chances are they might need to buy groceries. Chances are there's enough critical mass to justify a school. Chances are there's enough capital that allows, for other sorts of investment. When you have low density environments, this serendipity is reduced and it becomes very difficult. So I'm a fan of looking at some degree of vertical rising. You might have seen in my scheme, I spoke about 3 to 4 story sort of average heights. I do believe in the importance of occasional volume, because you actually need topography in the landscape, and it allows for variation and actual visual legibility, because when people are lost, they actually use architecture and cities to navigate themselves. So there's a There's a legibility dimension of urban form where I think you need to vary the height somewhat. But I'm a firm believer that when you get low density environments, they become economically unsustainable, ecologically unsustainable, and actually make it unaffordable for those communities. And there are lots of examples of this where low density environments mean that the simple cost of covering the infrastructure, roads, sewage, etc., becomes exorbitantly high because there aren't enough sort of people. So for me, it's more a question of density and understanding how do you get those sort of appropriate densities, which are not too dense, so that people lose touch with community, but there's a critical mass for serendipity, a critical mass for infrastructure investment, and a critical mass of open spaces that are meaningful. And so it's not so much either or, but I can definitely say that low density environments are fundamentally counterintuitive towards sustainable human settlements.
Thank you very much. If you're ready, there is another question directly for you regarding your presentation, and how you mentioned this idea of the neighborhood as a city. And the question is, do you have until now, have you got any comments on this proposal? Is there any feedback coming back you could share with us?
Well, first of all, the idea is maybe reframed differently, but it's not that unique, right? I think this question about how do we create neighborhoods out of the city and within the city is quite commonplace. Recently, we've heard about 10-minute neighborhoods where you can walk and get access to all sorts of environments between 10 and 15 minutes. That's the same sort of construct. If we look at some of the mega cities that we're aware of and the ones which are far much more convivial, you'll find that actually it's a clustering of small neighborhoods, each with their own sort of sub-identity that somehow works. So it's not so much an entirely new idea, but I think in places where I found traction, it's to kind of remind decision makers that we need to think about cities as an aggregation of small neighborhoods. Now, in this specific proposal, and it was really, that's worth another discussion in terms of the feedback. There was I was surprised by how it was well received in some respects, but also quite challenging. I'll give you an example. This question of an urban and public realm that pulls across the site and actually makes smaller courtyards as opposed to one large courtyard. It seems simplistic as a diagram, but there was some tension with I would mention the client. There was some tension that, the urban environment stays on the outside and then there's housing. So very much this notion of a fortress within the city as opposed to weaving. I thought that was quite challenging because it actually meant that the public open space system was under threat in the way that they'd imagined it. Another part which I thought was interesting was how this idea of this project actually engages by creating, urban parks and food production and so on. And the developers did not see that as part of their responsibility. Their job is to provide a unit, and anything related to public space making should be paid by somebody else. And then even this question about designing a unit so that it suits its potential to be converted for commercial opportunity was also resisted. So what was fascinating about this project was in many ways, it touched on many of the tropes or problems that we have in terms of development and ideas which are actually very detrimental to the production of human settlements. This notion of turning one's back on the public realm, this notion of not providing green space or minimal amount of investment in landscape infrastructure, this idea that housing cannot provide anything else but housing, and let's not talk about economic opportunity. And these are the actors who are shaping our cities right now. It's these forces of capital that are creating these intensely hostile environments. And it's so important for architects to not only be good designers, but to be adept with the language of capital so that we can actually subvert these relationships. I mean, this notion of spatial justice. So I'm very concerned about being agile as a designer, but also being agile in the language of finance, because often that gets used to counteract these innovations, which would actually make sustainable human settlements much more possible. including the desire for a one house, one plot sort of mentality, at most a duplex, and resisting this notion of shared infrastructure, shared space, and shared placemaking. Apologies for having too many ideas.
It's always inspiring and very straightforward, actually. I would like to keep up with the questions. Now, the next one will be a bit more general. I think both of you can contribute to its answer. Is about the 13th SDG, which is about climate action. Mr. Christopher Luanda is asking how architecture can comply with this UN Sustainable Development Goal, the climate action. I understand the question is actually how we can relate the two priorities. So if you think.
So I jump in.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, architecture can comply with the development goal, and there are lots of tools in the way of looking at the way that we construct things in a more sustainable manner or in a more environmentally responsible manner. From our perspective, it gets heavy when you're working with marginalized communities who are on the roll for housing development and on the lists for housing provision, where the pressure gets put on poor and marginalized groups to carry that burden. Is that the Global South is expected to do our development in a sustainable manner with climate action at the forefront when people don't have things like basic running water and clean sanitation. It makes it an incredibly difficult deliverable to touch both of those components. And obviously we'll try, but I mean, from our perspectives and a human rights perspective, we have to look at both because the environment is for everyone, but for us, the onus needs to be on the upper and more middle class environments. And that's, I mean, that's the approach that we've taken from one-to-one.
So I believe, well, I think it's important to not burden architecture with the ability to change all of the things that we see as being problematic, because at the end of the day, architects are agents of capital, right? We don't own our own buildings very often. We're designing for others and so on. So what the architect can do is to be an advocate for the right sort of decision making, to provide credible solutions that begin to address these issues, but always to recognize the limitations of that type of agency. That's the first thing. The second one, I think, would be, let's talk about materials. So materials and specification, the materials that we choose, you know, the embodied energy of those type of materials, even if they might seem cheap, if they have high embedded energy, I think there's something we need to bear in mind. We need to think critically about how buildings are assembled and how they're constructed, the extent to which we use materials. And I've done this before. I've worked with concrete before I fully understood the sort of embodied energy, the water implications of concrete production, etc. And now I'm much more in terms of working with nature-based solutions in order to mitigate the climate impact of my designs. And then I also think it's about how do we aggregate architecture together. So we can talk about a singular building, but how do these buildings then come together in order to create neighborhoods, to create space, to actually reduce the overall carbon footprint, both in its construction, but also in the operation. I shared a stat that I think 35% of the carbon emissions is due to how buildings are run. So if we have improper orientation, if we're using glass in areas where it's going to produce high HVAC costs, if we are making incorrect urban planning decisions because we like how it looks in plan, but we're not taking into account the environment or the weather or the particular challenges of place, then we're going to end up creating very, very climate hostile environments, and even the issue of where we even locate these settlements. If you look at all of the projections in terms of where the planet is growing hotter, there are a number of cities that in the next 60 to 70 years will actually be uninhabitable, because they will actually exceed the sort of median range for what the average temperature should be for human beings. So we also have to start asking ourselves, where are we building? I mean, the point was raised by my colleague around floodplains, etc. But also we should be looking at heat maps. We should be thinking very carefully about food supply. So I think it's not just architecture. I think it's really an ecosystem of actors and agents who are involved in how capital and policy deploys decision-making to make urban environments. And then the question is, what is the role of the architect in the creation of the city? And I think that that's where the sharper we get at what we're good at, advocacy, material specification, morphology of cities, understanding labor practices and so on, but then holding other agents in the ecosystem accountable, the better. So I think you can't divorce architecture from banks. I think you can't divorce it from developers. I think you can't divorce it from city planning, and I think you can't divorce it from community. So all of these actors contribute to creating sustainable human settlements. And I just say this, I'm quite passionate about this issue because all too often the dialogue is often about how architecture can suddenly transform these cities. We are an important cog in a big machine, but it's a big machine. And the more we understand the machine, the better the cog can work. Over.
Thank you. I could have a last question, if possible, which somehow starts our conclusions, which will be given following the answer to this question by our dear colleague, Kazi Arif, who is the co-director of our working program. Now, this last question would be, are we equipped for this new role? Like, in our education to start with, and in the kind of the way the practice is organized and the institutions along the practice, nationally and internationally. Are we equipped to do that? But would you propose something to schools, for example, and to young students and architects?
Jackie, do you want to handle that one, and I'll go after you? Or I can go first. It's up to you. What do you like? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'll jump in. I think we're getting there. There are schools that are starting to talk about, I mean, from my perspective, which is around participative engagement and looking at things from a more holistic approach. I think that also as architects and as professionals, when we leave colleges and universities, this picture of what an architect could be in a big corporate is maybe not the only option or the only way to architect. We have huge amounts of tools and skills that are developed in architectural practice, and just exposing students to the other ways of using those skills and the other ways of engaging, other than just designing buildings, designing houses, and doing exactly what a client wants from you. I think the empowerment and advocacy can happen in architecture schools. I mean, we see it in South Africa already. There are departments that are doing that, as well as in Europe. I mean, the ASF projects, teaching tools and engagements and participative design, it's happening. It's happening already. So no, we're not equipped yet, but we're getting there, I think. Yeah. Okay, over. I was going to say that.
I think the state of the world tells us that we're not equipped. I think we can just look around and and why I say we're not equipped is, on the one hand, this goes back to my previous comment, I think sometimes we take on too much as architects, and also we don't hold other actors accountable. But I also think in terms of how we produce graduates, it's still quite the traditional model that every graduate is somehow measured by their ability to design a building. Whereas if we think of architecture in terms of the built environment, we need more architects who are better at finance. We need more architects who understand economic modeling. We need more architects who understand policy formulation. We need more architects who may not be designers, but they're absolutely adept at project management. We need more architects who are able to navigate some of the complexities of the built environment. This does not mean that we should not be focused on, high quality design and so on. I mean, that's great for a portion of our graduate, but I think that has somehow eclipsed other sorts of talents. And it's also meant that when we go out into the workplace, if an architect starts to speak about these other issues, they have very low credibility because the expectation is that an architect only draws and does not have anything to say about economic policy, does not have anything to say about community development, etc. So we need to reestablish our role in the built environment as agents of change who may design, but might be involved in policy formulation, might go into urban design, might even go into politics. And until we restructure our education to say there are different ways for an architect to be an architect, I think that we're going to find a lot of miscommunication, a lot of our talent, a lot of our talent not being used where it could be effective, and frankly, it increasingly becoming more of a niche discipline that looks for the occasional client that understands what you're trying to do, whereas in reality, given the explosion of cities, we need architectural expertise everywhere. Architects should become developers. Architects should be on the supply side. Architects should be developing materials. Architects should be working in banks, approving funding for innovative housing projects. But until we decouple ourselves from this thin sliver of romance around design, I think we will increasingly find ourselves struggling for relevancy. So I think the output of our education institutions need to adjust. I believe it's great if we all have a common base of design. So that common land is very, very useful to bridging dissonance, if you will, in the built environment. But I do think we should really be thinking about how do we diversify our graduates and how do we make the built environment a place where architects can show up in different ways. Then I think we're going to make amazing cities and amazing environments. But we have a 18th century framing around what an architect is, and it's not helping us for the 21st century.
Thank you, McKenna. Thank you, Jackie. And I now ask our colleague Kazi Arif to present us with the conclusions of this meeting today and to end our meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, for wonderfully moderating this session. And what an intriguing session it was with this high power presentation from two of our colleagues from the Southern Hemisphere, the South Africa. Before going into details of whatever we have been listening to, let me just share with you that this is the second seminar in a sequel, the first of which was aired in August last year with the title Sustainable Housing for Resilient Communities, with the tagline Challenges of Affordability. And today or tonight or this evening, we are hosting the second webinar, which talks about the impact on environment as a sequel of the first one. So I think the speakers we have tonight have spoken right on the spot, talked about the environmental issues of the current world in terms of climate change and other crises. And I must congratulate both the speakers for their intelligent and intriguing and so passionate presentations. And I'm sure Jackie, pulled out or mentioned a lot of passionate and sensitive issues. She questioned about the definition of sustainability, resilience, communities, impacts, and environment. And there were a lot of food for our thoughts in a different way. How do we address these issues, kind of going out of the box? And she uses the words complex and conflicts, which are really important in our practice and pedagogy of architecture when we talk about theories and we find not too much similarities of what we learn and what we see on the ground. There were sensational visuals of environmental crisis and the dilapidated communities in some parts of those South Africas. But at the end, she also mentions about some hopes of working together for the communities, some co-creation or co-activities to bring them out of those crises. I must thank Jackie for her passionate involvement with whatever she is doing. Now coming to Mokena's presentation, very lively, very thorough, and it proves that he has been very much involved with whatever he is in his practice and whatever he presents. I took the intro. It was very interesting for me to know about the FLOW, F-L-O-W, the future of living for one world. I think all of us are striving to achieve one world for all of us. He talked about the vulnerability of Africa to climate change. I feel the same about my country, wherever I am from. I'm from Bangladesh, and Bangladesh faces one of the worst challenges for climate change. So I feel kind of heart to heart with what Mokena was telling. And he rightly said that we, the architects, are not passive agents. We have to work directly on ground to make this planet more habitable in the challenges of the future. We need to come out with solution, work with other shareholders, stakeholders of the industry. And I also like the way he said the human-centric design and its importance, the importance of planet-centric approach, and the sixth sense approach that he also mentioned in the whole ecological process. And he ended up with a very, what should I say, to the point, successful example that he worked with, that urban design, that blends urban design and architecture, a certainly creative approach, which brings together the privacy, the light and shadows, the forms, the importance of volume and scale, and a new vocabulary of what housing should look like in this 21st century. I must also congratulate Mokena for his very much lively presentation, which was a learning process for me also. And both of the speakers looked extremely confident and extremely committed. That's where the true essence of architects and architecture should be for this challenging works wherever we are. I must also thank our president, Jose Luis Cortes, and Secretary General Paying to be with us this evening. My co-director colleague, Nadia, of course, moderator Nicholas, he has been doing extremely good in moderating the session. My colleagues, other colleagues in UIA for providing us all the preparations and the technical supports. And of course, all the colleagues from all across the member section who have enjoyed this session, I think, which is very much relevant to what UIA says about leaving no one behind. And I also want to inform that the UIA Congress 2023 is right next in the few months in July in Copenhagen. And I assure you that community architecture and human rights work program is going to organize another roundtable right at Copenhagen, and also an inclusive exhibits of all the best practices from all the member section across the world, which would focus on community architecture and human rights. I would like to extend my invitation to every one of you, including our colleagues who are watching or attending this seminar, to kind of join us in Copenhagen and join this UIA World Congress and make it a greater success. So this is my last note, and I would really like to appreciate all your efforts to make this webinar a successful effort for this community architecture and human rights work program. Thank you very much. Everyone, please stay blessed until the next event by community architecture and human rights at UIA. Thank you so much.